I want a divorce.
Come in first. You're getting the floor wet.
Did you hear what I said?
I heard you. You want a divorce. I heard you the first time, Doyun. What do you want me to do? Scream? Would that make it easier for you to leave?
The apartment door opened. Rainwater dripped from Kang Doyun's coat onto the marble floor. He didn't take off his shoes. He didn't say hello. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "I want a divorce." Catherine Peter didn't scream. She didn't cry. She carefully set the ceramic bowl onto the kitchen counter. "Come in first," she said quietly. "You're getting the floor wet." He stood there, dripping, keys still in his hand, waiting for the moment to break the way he'd rehearsed it breaking. Catherine collapsing, Catherine reaching for the vase his mother had given them, and Catherine secretly hated, Catherine giving him something to defend himself against. Instead, she folded the dish towel over the oven handle, unhurried, and looked at him the way you look at weather you've already checked the forecast for. "Did you hear what I said? I heard you. You want a divorce." She said it plainly, the way you'd confirm an appointment. "I heard you the first time, Doyun. Then why are you acting like I just told you dinner's ready? What do you want me to do? Scream? Would that make it easier for you to leave?" He didn't answer. She walked past him into the living room and sat on the arm of the sofa. Never the middle, she'd told him once. The middle was for people who intended to stay, and looked at him with an evenness that unsettled him more than his mother's cutting remarks ever had. "Is it Seoyeon?" The name landed like a slap he hadn't braced for. "How do you—" "Your mother mentioned her at the shareholders' dinner in March. Such a suitable match, if only things were different." Catherine's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I understood Korean by then. I'd understood it for over a year. I just let your family believe otherwise. People say interesting things in front of a woman they think can't understand them." If this is the first time you've caught Catherine's silence for what it really was, patience, not ignorance, you already know why this story kept people watching until the end. "Stay with her." He sank into the armchair across from her, the confession he'd walked in with now smaller than the one she'd just handed him. "It's not about Seoyeon," he said, though even he could hear how unconvincing it sounded. "It's about everything. My mother, the company. The way my father looks at me like I ruined the Kang name by marrying a black woman." She finished it without flinching, because she'd said the sentence to herself in the mirror more times than she could count. "You can say it. I've heard it in every language your family speaks, including the ones they think I don't." "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant. You just don't like hearing it out loud, because saying it out loud means admitting you let them win." Rain against glass. Somewhere below them, 31 floors down, Seoul kept moving, indifferent to the marriage dissolving in a penthouse it would never know existed. "I stopped being angry about 4 months ago," she said, "when you started coming home smelling like her perfume and thought I wouldn't notice. I've had time to grieve this already. You're only just arriving at the funeral." He flinched. "You knew." "Of course I knew. I just decided I wasn't going to fight for a place I was never fully welcomed into. I have some pride left. Not much, but some." He'd expected rage. He'd built himself an entire argument for rage. Reasons, defenses, a wall of justifications to hide behind. Her calm dismantled it in under 10 minutes, and what stood in its place was something he hadn't let himself feel in a year. Shame. "I don't actually want a divorce," he said quietly. "I said it because I thought, if I said it first, it would hurt less than if you eventually left me for someone who actually chose you back." "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in a year." She didn't move toward the door he was hoping she'd walk back through. "But it doesn't change anything. You didn't come here tonight to save this marriage. You came here to be forgiven for ending it. Those aren't the same thing. So what happens now?" She stood and looked out at the city that had never quite let her belong to it either. Not the boardrooms that hired her for her portfolio and quietly excluded her from client dinners. Not the mother-in-law who complimented her English at every family gathering as if it were a party trick. Not the husband who loved her in private and apologized for her in public. "Now I go back to Lagos. Not because you're divorcing me, because I'm choosing myself before you get the chance to choose someone else in front of me. I have a design firm waiting for a partner. I have a mother who's been asking when I'm coming home for 3 years. I put a life on hold to become Mrs. Kang, and I'd like it back." Just like that? Just like that. Her voice softened. Not for him, but for the girl she'd been when she first arrived in Seoul. Certain love alone could translate every difference between them. You asked for a divorce expecting me to fall apart, so you could feel like the one who was hurt. I won't give you that. I'm just finally leaving somewhere I was never given a real say in. He didn't cry, though he came close. What he felt instead was rawer, the particular grief of realizing, too late, that the person you underestimated had already outgrown you. I'm sorry, he said, and for once he meant it. She nodded, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. I know, but sorry doesn't undo 3 years of making myself smaller for people who were never going to make room for me anyway. She picked up her phone, already scrolling to the mover she'd quietly contacted 2 weeks ago. Take care of yourself, Doyun. He left before she did, which surprised them both. No scene, no argument in the elevator. Just a man walking out of a marriage he'd ended with 4 rehearsed words, into a life that suddenly felt heavier than the one he thought he wanted. Catherine stood at the window a long while after the door clicked shut, watching the rain slow to a drizzle over the city lights. What she felt, standing there, was something unfamiliar and almost frightening in its lightness. Relief. She let herself wonder, briefly, whether relief this complete meant she'd been grieving the marriage far longer than she'd admitted to anyone, even herself. Then, because there would be time enough later to sit inside that question, she picked up the first box and began. She called her mother the morning after Doyun left, before she'd let herself cry, before she'd let herself do anything except sit on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets, phone in hand, unsure what she was even calling to say. He asked for a divorce, Catherine said when her mother picked up, and was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. Her mother didn't gasp, didn't offer the shocked, performative sympathy Catherine had half braced for. She was quiet for a moment, and then said, simply, "How do you feel? Not are you all right?" Not what happened. How do you feel? A question that assumed Catherine's feelings were the relevant information, rather than the facts of what Doyun had done. Relieved, Catherine admitted, and hearing herself say it out loud made it more true. Which frightens me a little. I think I should be devastated. Grief doesn't always arrive on schedule, her mother said. Sometimes it already happened, quietly, long before the official news catches up to it. You've been grieving that marriage for a long time, Catherine. I've heard it in your voice for 2 years, even when you were still insisting everything was fine. You never said anything. You weren't ready to hear it. I raised you to make your own decisions, even the ones I could see coming before you could. A pause, warm rather than accusing. Come home, if you want to. Or don't. Either way, you don't have to decide today. Catherine hadn't decided that day. It would be another 6 months before she understood that coming home didn't have to mean Lagos, that somewhere in the process of building a studio out of raw concrete and stubbornness, Seoul had quietly become a place she'd chosen for herself, rather than one she'd simply been placed in. 4 years earlier, Catherine had met him hiding from a networking event in the back room of a gallery in Itaewon, both of them avoiding the same crowd for different reasons. She was 28, 3 years into a design career in Lagos that was going nowhere fast. In Seoul, on a 6-month fellowship she'd nearly turned down twice, certain the whole trip was an indulgence she couldn't afford. He stood beside a sculpture no one else in the room seemed to understand, turning a glass of wine he wasn't drinking. When she asked what he thought it meant, he said, without hesitation, I think the artist was angry at his father and didn't know how to say so directly. She laughed, really laughed, because it was the first honest thing anyone had said to her all night. He didn't ask where she was from the way everyone else had that evening. He asked what she was working on, and listened, remembered details she'd mentioned only once, and by the end of the night she'd forgotten she was supposed to be networking at all. You're going to think I'm strange, he said, walking her to the taxi stand, but I don't want this to be the only time I talk to you. I think it's the first honest thing anyone said to me tonight, and you already used up your first one on the sculpture. He laughed, unguarded, nothing like the careful, managed version of himself she'd come to know so well in the years after. And she thought, riding home, that she had never felt so entirely seen by a stranger. It was easy that summer. He learned to cook her mother's jollof badly, and with great enthusiasm, burning the pot twice before she banned him from the stove. She learned enough Korean to argue with taxi drivers, though she let him believe, for a long time after, that her understanding stopped there. A small private joke at first, something that curdled slowly, over years, into something closer to armor. They were convinced love was a kind of translation that got easier with practice, that every difference between them was a door, not a wall being built one polite silence at a time. The proposal itself she would replay for years afterward, turning it over the way you turn over a coin to check if it's real. He'd taken her to the rooftop without telling her why, claiming a client dinner nearby had fallen through and he didn't want to waste the view. She hadn't questioned it. Doyun's excuses had always been easy to believe, back then, because he'd never yet given her reason to check them. "My grandmother offered me her ring for this," he said, when he finally knelt, and I said no. "That's a strange thing to lead with. I wanted this to be only about us, not the family, not the name, not what anyone expects the ring to look like at a shareholders' dinner." He held up a ring that was, she would later learn, entirely his own choice, entirely his own money, a small rebellion she wouldn't fully understand the size of until years later, when she'd seen exactly how little of himself he was allowed to spend without his family's approval. "I know what I'm asking you to marry into. I don't know yet how to protect you from all of it. I just know I don't want to do any of it without you." She said yes before he'd finished the sentence, and for one entire summer afterward, she let herself believe that a man capable of that single act of defiance would keep finding the courage to repeat it. It would take her 3 years to understand that courage, in Doyun, had a limit, and that she had used up most of it that one night on the roof, without either of them realizing it at the time. The wedding was small on her side, her mother, 2 aunts, her closest friend Esther flying in specially, and enormous on his, 200 guests who had come to evaluate rather than celebrate. Catherine remembered watching her new mother-in-law's face throughout the ceremony and mistaking the tight, unmoving expression for nerves rather than what it actually was, a woman calculating, in real time, exactly how much damage control the marriage would require. 3 months into married life, at a family dinner meant to formally welcome her, Mrs. Kang corrected Catherine's chopstick grip in front of the table, and then turned to Doyun and said, in Korean, assuming his wife's silence meant she couldn't follow, "At least she's teachable." Catherine smiled through it, thanked her mother-in-law for the correction in careful, polished Korean of her own, and watched the older woman's face rearrange itself into something between surprise and quiet insult, as if Catherine understanding the language at all was an act of trespass. She waited, under the table, for Doyun's hand to find hers. It didn't come. He was already reaching for his water glass, already changing the subject to something safer, the way he would learn to do 100 more times before either of them called it a pattern. She never told him what his mother had said that night. She told herself, driving home, that she was protecting him from a fight he hadn't asked for. It would take her another 2 years to understand she had actually been protecting herself, from watching him choose comfort over her, in a room small enough that his silence couldn't be mistaken for anything else. That was the night, she realized much later, that she began keeping a small, private ledger of every silence he'd let sit uncorrected. She wouldn't understand until years afterward that she'd stopped adding to it, not because the silences had ended, but because she'd stopped expecting them to. In the early years there was real tenderness, and she wanted to remember that honestly, rather than rewrite the whole marriage into a single unbroken tragedy for the sake of an easier goodbye. Mornings he made her coffee before she woke, the ratio memorized without being asked. A night he cried, unprompted, at an old Fela Kuti record she'd played for him, because he said it made him understand, for the first time, some fraction of what she'd given up to be there. That version of him grew rarer every year, squeezed smaller by boardrooms and dinners, and a mother who treated Catherine's every success as a wound to the family's image, until the man who eventually stood dripping in their doorway asking for a divorce was almost entirely a stranger, built out of other people's expectations, with only faint traces of the boy who'd once told her a sculpture was about a son's anger at his father, unprompted, honest, unafraid. She didn't hate that boy, She thought she still loved him a little, in the specific and harmless way you love someone who no longer exists. What she'd stopped loving, long before the word divorce, was the man he'd let himself become in his family's shadow. She wondered, packing the last of her books into a box that night, whether he even remembered the boy from the gallery anymore, or whether his family had finished erasing him so thoroughly that only she still carried proof he'd once existed. Doyun didn't sleep the night he left her. He sat in his car in the parking garage of his own building for 40 minutes, before going up, replaying a version of the conversation where she'd fought for him, where her composure cracked and gave him something to hold on to besides his own guilt. He kept returning to the moment she'd said his mother's name in Korean, the small, terrible efficiency of it, and understanding, too late, that she had likely rehearsed that sentence longer than he'd rehearsed his 4 words. He hadn't expected the quiet to feel like this, not peace, but a kind of exposure, as though something that had been propping him up for years had just been kicked away. His mother called before he'd even reached his apartment. "It's done?" she asked, not quite able to keep the relief from her voice. "It's done," he said, and hated how much it sounded like a business update. "You did the right thing. Doyun. Seoyeon's family will be pleased." He didn't answer. He was thinking of a dinner 3 years earlier, a comment about chopsticks, a silence he'd let sit in the air because filling it had felt harder than letting it pass. He hadn't remembered that dinner in a long time. He wasn't sure why it surfaced now, except that some part of him already suspected he'd find, in the coming months, that guilt arrives on its own schedule, indifferent to whether you're ready for it. "Are you still there?" his mother asked. "I'm here," he said. And then, because it was the only honest thing he could offer her that night, "I just don't feel the way I thought I would." His mother was quiet for a moment, a rare enough thing that he noticed it. "Relief takes time," she said finally, which wasn't an answer to what he'd actually meant, but was, he suspected, the closest thing to comfort she knew how to offer. Mrs. Kang came to see Catherine exactly once before the papers were finalized, on a Thursday afternoon set aside for packing, unannounced, the way she'd always preferred to arrive, as if warning gave the other person too much time to prepare a defense. "You're really going through with it," Mrs. Kang said, standing in the half-emptied living room, surveying the boxes with an expression Catherine couldn't quite read. Not triumph, something closer to discomfort, as though the sight of Catherine's competent, methodical packing had unsettled some private image she'd carried of her son's wife for 3 years. "I am," Catherine said, taping a box shut without looking up. "You could fight for more. My lawyers expected you to fight for more." "I don't want more of what your family has to offer, Mrs. Kang." Catherine finally straightened, met the older woman's eyes directly, something she'd rarely allowed herself in 3 years of careful deference. "I never actually wanted it. I wanted your son to choose me the way I chose him. Everything else was just the price of admission I thought I had to pay." Mrs. Kang's jaw tightened. "You think this is easy for me? Watching my son's marriage fail?" "I think," Catherine said, not unkindly, "that you spent 3 years making sure it would." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 women who had never once, in 3 years, spoken to each other without an audience, without the polite architecture of a dinner table or a shareholders' function holding their true feelings in check. "You were never what I wanted for him," Mrs. Kang admitted finally, quietly, as if the admission cost her something. "I won't pretend otherwise. But I watched you at that opening dinner, the one where you gave the toast in Korean, without anyone helping you write it. I watched the room go silent. Even I was surprised." She paused. "I don't know that I ever told you that." "You didn't," Catherine said. "No," Mrs. Kang agreed. "I don't suppose I did." She turned toward the door, composure already reassembling itself, the moment of unguarded honesty folding closed, like something that had never happened. "Good luck, Catherine." "I mean that, however little you believe me." Catherine watched her go, and felt to her own surprise no satisfaction in the exchange at all, only a kind of tired clarity, the sense of a door closing on a room she no longer needed to enter. She didn't yet know it wouldn't be the last she heard from that particular room. 6 months after the rain, Catherine no longer flinched at the sound of a phone buzzing on marble counters. Grief, she'd learned, doesn't arrive the way films promise. Not as one dramatic collapse. It arrives as small absences. The empty side of a bed she relearned to sleep diagonally across. The extra place setting she'd catch herself laying before she remembered. She grieved exactly as much as she needed to, and then, on a gray Tuesday in March, walked into a leasing office in Seongsu-dong and signed a 2-year contract on 400 square feet of raw concrete that smelled like sawdust and possibility. Peter and Yoon's studio wasn't real yet. It existed as a name stenciled on glass, a registration number, and a bank account with far less in it than her mother in Lagos believed. But it was hers. "You could have taken the full settlement," her lawyer Ji-hoon said over coffee, flipping through the paperwork with the mild exasperation of a man watching a client leave money on the table out of principle. "More than generous. You'd never have to work again." "I don't want to never work again." She stirred sugar into coffee she didn't actually like sweet, a habit left over from 3 years of sweetening it for a husband who did. "I want them to watch me build something they can't buy back." The smaller settlement releases faster. No confidentiality clause. No non-compete tying you to silence about the marriage. He slid a folder across the table. "You understand what you're giving up." "I understand exactly what I'm giving up," she said. "A cage with better lighting." He closed the folder. "You're going to make my job very boring, you know. Divorces are usually about revenge. Yours is about spite disguised as ambition. Same thing, just better dressed." The studio's first client was a boutique hotel in Hongdae that wanted its lobby to feel, as the owner vaguely put it, like coming home, but expensive. Catherine translated the ache into rust-colored leather, brass salvaged from a shuttered textile mill in Daegu, and a mural by a Nigerian Korean artist she found on Instagram at 2 a.m., scrolling instead of crying. The mural became the thing people photographed. The hotel became the thing people talked about, and Catherine Peter, no longer Mrs. Kang, a name she'd shed the way you shed a coat that never fit right in the shoulders, became, slowly, a name whispered in rooms she used to be excluded from. It wasn't fast. There were months she ate ramyeon standing at her counter because delivery felt like an expense she couldn't justify. Months she lied to her mother about how well things were going, because the truth felt like admitting Doyun's family had been right about her all along. In the studio's 4th month, a client's payment fell through, and Catherine sat on the concrete floor doing the math on her remaining runway 3 times, hoping the number might change on the 3rd attempt. It didn't. She called Esther that night, one of the few friends from Seoul's small Nigerian community she'd let herself stay close to, back when Doyun's world had left little room for anyone outside it. Esther didn't offer platitudes. "Come eat something. You haven't eaten today. I can hear it in your voice." Catherine went, and sat in a cramped apartment eating jollof that tasted almost right, listening to Yoruba and Igbo tangled with Korean slang, laughing at nothing in particular for the first time in a week. Esther didn't ask her once about Doyun that night, which Catherine understood, without being told, as its own quiet form of kindness. She hired Minjun the next morning anyway, on a salary she couldn't quite afford, because some decisions are investments in the person you're becoming, rather than the one counting coins at 2 a.m. There were also, increasingly, mornings when she stood in the middle of her cluttered studio and felt something she hadn't felt in years, weightless, unwatched, entirely herself. Then one Tuesday, an email arrived from a name she didn't recognize, requesting a pitch meeting for a building she'd have been laughed out of a room for even mentioning a year earlier. By the studio's 10th month, Peter and Yoon had outgrown its first small reputation. A gallery owner in Samcheong-dong hired Catherine on the strength of the Hongdae Hotel alone, and that project, a quiet, light-filled space built around the idea that art needed room to breathe rather than a backdrop to compete with, became the one industry critics would cite, months later, as proof she wasn't a one-project success. Minjun brought her the first favorable review, printed and taped to her studio door like a prize. "You're not going to read it," he said, watching her walk past it toward the coffee machine. "I read the first one. I'll read this one eventually. You never read your own reviews." "I read the invoices," she said, The reviews are for other people to decide what I mean. The invoices are for me to decide whether I'm still standing. But she paused at the door on her way out that evening and let herself read it once, quickly, before pretending she hadn't. It was around then that she stopped flinching at the word divorced when new clients asked casually about her name, Peter, not Kang, and started answering instead with the particular ease of someone who had stopped treating her own history as something to apologize for. She and Doyun crossed paths once, in the lobby of a building she was pitching to. He looked thinner, tired in a way expensive suits couldn't disguise. Catherine. He said her name like he wasn't sure he still had the right to. Doyun. She adjusted her portfolio bag, unbothered. How are you? Fine. You look well. I am. She wasn't performing it. That was the strangest part. Congratulations, by the way. I heard about Soyeon. Something flickered across his face. It didn't work out, with her. Catherine felt nothing sharp about it. No triumph. Just the mild sympathy you'd offer a stranger. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? No, she admitted, without cruelty. But I don't wish you unhappiness either. I just don't think about you enough anymore to wish you much of anything. He absorbed that like a verdict he'd already suspected was coming. You're here for the Hana Group contract. I am. They're difficult. I've survived worse. She let the smallest smile touch her mouth. Take care of yourself. She didn't look back to see his expression. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't performing calm for anyone. It had stopped being armor. It had become, quietly, just who she was. A fact that seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. Soyeon had lasted 11 months. Long enough for Doyun to understand, slowly, and then all at once, that she'd wanted the Kang name attached to her own, far more than she'd ever wanted him attached to her life. She corrected his posture at dinners the way his mother once had. She rehearsed opinions before family gatherings the way he'd once, briefly, been grateful Catherine never bothered to. She never once asked him what he was afraid of, and it took him nearly a year to notice that the omission bothered him at all. He thought of Catherine more than he let his mother know, not with longing exactly, but with the specific ache of a man realizing that the easiest relationship he'd ever had was the one he'd spent 3 years failing to protect, and the hardest one he'd chosen instead had asked nothing real of him at all. He caught himself, once, reaching to tell Soyeon something funny that had happened at work, the way he used to tell Catherine, before remembering that Soyeon had never once asked him to. His mother, when Soyeon ended things, said only, "There will be someone else suitable." Doyun didn't answer. He was thinking, uselessly, of a woman who'd once given a wedding toast in Korean she'd taught herself, in a room that had never once thanked her for the effort. He wondered, not for the first time, what exactly his mother meant by suitable, and whether he had ever once asked himself the same question about anyone, including her. Doyun drove past the gallery in Itaewon once, months after the divorce, on a night he couldn't later explain to himself with any real honesty. It had become a wine bar by then, the sculpture long since sold or discarded, but he sat in his car across the street for nearly 20 minutes anyway, remembering a version of himself who had once said something true to a stranger without calculating what it would cost him. He couldn't remember, sitting there, the last time he'd said anything to anyone, Soyeon, his mother, the board, without first running it through the particular filter he'd built over a decade of being his father's son. He wasn't sure when the filter had gone up. He suspected, uncomfortably, that it had always been there, and that Catherine had simply been the last person patient enough to keep waiting for it to come down. He read about the Hana Group tower, opening in an industry newsletter his assistant forwarded without comment, a small mercy he was grateful for. He didn't attend. He told himself it was respect, that showing up would have made the evening about him in a way it shouldn't be, and there was some truth in that, though it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he wasn't certain he could stand in a room and watch Catherine Peter be exactly as extraordinary as he'd always half known she was, without everyone in the room seeing on his face what it cost him to have let her go. He kept the article anyway, in a folder on his laptop he didn't examine too closely, alongside 3 others about smaller projects she'd completed in the 2 years since. He told himself this was simply due diligence, a competitor's growth worth tracking. He was 36 years old and had built an entire career on telling convincing lies to boardrooms, and this was, he suspected, the first one he had ever fully believed. The Hana Group pitch was for a flagship building in Gangnam, 12 floors, a rooftop restaurant, a lobby that needed to say, "In marble and light, we are the future of this industry." It was the biggest contract Peter and Yoon's studio had ever pursued, and Catherine had rehearsed her presentation until the words stopped feeling like words at all. She didn't expect the man at the head of the boardroom table to be the reason her calm faltered, however slightly, for the first time in months. Kim Tae-min had turned down 3 previous firms, each with bigger names and bigger budgets than hers. He sat with his arms crossed through the first 10 minutes, expression unreadable, and Catherine found herself doing something she hadn't done in front of a client in a long time, fighting for the room. "You keep using the word authentic," he interrupted, not unkindly, but directly, in a way that reminded her, startlingly, of nothing she'd known in her marriage. Doyun had never interrupted her in meetings. He'd never needed to. He simply hadn't been present in them. What does that actually mean? In materials? In cost? "It means I won't put brass in your lobby because brass photographs well," she said. "It means every material should earn its place, the way every person in your company had to earn theirs. It means I design spaces that feel true, not expensive for the sake of looking expensive. I think you already know the difference, or you wouldn't have turned down 3 firms who gave you exactly what you asked for instead of what you actually needed." The room went quiet. Somewhere behind her, Minjun held his breath. Taemin uncrossed his arms. "You're the first person in 6 meetings who's disagreed with me, instead of trying to sell me something." "I don't sell things I don't believe in. Character flaw? Ask my accountant." Something that might have been the start of a smile crossed his face before he put it away. Professional again. "Send revised numbers by Friday. I want to see what earning its place actually costs." She got the contract 3 weeks later, the single largest win of her career. It was also, though she wouldn't admit it to herself for another 2 months, the beginning of something she hadn't let herself consider possible. Taemin didn't pursue her, which was, she'd later realize, the entire reason it worked. He showed up to site visits early. He remembered that she took her coffee black now, no sugar. A change she hadn't consciously decided to make but had, somewhere in the months of rebuilding. He never commented on her accent, never introduced her with the faint apologetic undertone she'd spent 3 years learning to detect in Doyun's voice. But he was also, she noticed, the kind of man who answered emails at midnight and called it discipline rather than avoidance, who rescheduled their 3rd dinner twice for meetings that could have waited, who seemed more comfortable disagreeing with her about tile grout than admitting he'd rather not talk about his father at all. "You're staring at your phone like it insulted your mother," Minjun said one evening, the 2 of them the last ones left in the studio among cold coffee cups. "It's from Taemin, about the restaurant materials." "Sure. Work messages don't usually make people smile like that, but sure." She threw a fabric swatch at him. He caught it, laughing, and left her alone with the message glowing on her phone. "Dinner tomorrow, to discuss the restaurant concept. Not a work thing if you don't want it to be. Your choice." "Not a work thing," she typed back, after a long moment. 7 p.m. The restaurant wasn't the kind of place Doyun would have picked. No maitre d' who recognized a family name, just plastic stools and a grill built into the table. "This isn't what I expected," she admitted. "What did you expect?" "Somewhere that photographs well." She let the echo of his own words land between them. "I'm not interested in things that only photograph well," he said, turning the meat without looking up. "Can I ask you something? You turned down 3 firms with bigger names. Why me?" "Because you disagreed with me. Nobody does that. Everyone in that boardroom is so afraid of losing the contract, they say yes to things they know are wrong, and I end up with a building full of other people's cowardice." He finally looked up. "I wanted to work with someone who'd tell me the truth even when it's expensive." "That's a very corporate answer." "It's not the only answer," he said, "but it's the one appropriate for a business dinner." She felt something in her chest loosen, not the rush she remembered from the early days with Doyun, but something steadier. "And the inappropriate one?" He met her eyes across the grill. "I started paying attention to you before I let myself call it that. I'm telling you that honestly, and I'd like you to know it doesn't come easily to me. Ask anyone at Hana Group whether I talk about anything that isn't work. They'll tell you I don't. Is that a warning? It's an admission. He turned the meat again, a small, self-deprecating tension in his jaw. I've been told I disappear into it. Work. That I'd rather solve a problem than sit inside a feeling. My mother says it's why my father and I get along so well, which she doesn't mean as a compliment. I can work with difficult, Catherine said. I married easy, once. It wasn't actually easier. He almost laughed, caught off guard by her. And for a moment, the careful architecture of the evening slipped, and she saw something unguarded underneath it, gone again before she could be sure she hadn't imagined it. The third date happened on a rooftop bar Taemin chose specifically, he admitted later, because it was too loud for either of them to fall back on small talk. They'd been circling each other for weeks by then, careful, deliberate, the particular caution of two people who had each already survived one version of themselves they didn't want to repeat. "Can I ask you something that isn't about the contract?" he said, turning his glass slowly on the table between them. "You can ask. I reserve the right not to answer." Fair. He studied her for a moment, the directness in his gaze, the same directness that had first unsettled her across a boardroom table. "What are you afraid of?" She hadn't expected the question, and something in her chest went still before it went soft. That's an unusual thing to ask on a third date. "I've never been good at the usual questions. What do you do? Where are you from? What's your favorite film?" Everyone asks those. Nobody learns anything from the answers. "You want to learn something?" "I want to know if I'm wasting both our time," he said without apology. "So what are you afraid of?" She considered lying, the way she might have once, offering something small and manageable instead of something true. Instead, she looked out at the skyline, at the particular blur of lights that had come to mean something different to her than it once had, and told him the truth. "Becoming small again," she said. "I spent 3 years shrinking myself into the shape someone else's family could tolerate. I got good at it. Frighteningly good. I'm afraid of being good at it again, without noticing, the way I didn't notice the first time until there was almost nothing left of me to notice with." Taemin didn't rush to reassure her, which she would come to understand, in time, as one of the things she trusted about him. He simply sat with what she'd said for a long moment, letting it exist in the air between them instead of hurrying to soften it. "Then I'll make sure there's always room for all of you," he said finally. "Not the parts that are convenient. All of it." She didn't answer right away. The city hummed beneath them, indifferent and enormous, and she found she didn't need him to say anything else. It was, she would think later, the first promise anyone had made her in years that hadn't immediately asked for something back. 3 months later, on a call that stretched past midnight, her mother asked, "A Korean man again? Catherine, are you certain? He's not like Doyun, Mama." "They never are, in the beginning. He introduces me by my full name in every room. He asked me, on our third date, what I was afraid of. Nobody's asked me that before, not even you." Her mother was quiet a long moment. "And what did you tell him?" "That I was afraid of becoming small again." And he said, "Then I'll make sure there's always room for all of you. Not the parts that are convenient. All of it." "That's a good answer." "It's the only one I needed." "When your father died," her mother said softer now, "I told myself I'd never again let someone else decide how much of my own life I was allowed to take up. I don't think I ever taught you that properly. I let you learn it the hard way instead. You didn't let anything happen to me. I made my own choices. Yes, and now you're making better ones." A pause, and then brighter. "Bring him to Lagos. Let me feed him something that will actually test whether he's serious. I'll warn him about the pepper soup. Don't you dare. Let him suffer honestly." It wasn't without friction. 6 weeks before the Hana Tower opened, Taemin pushed back a client walkthrough for the third time, and Catherine, standing in an empty lobby surrounded by swatches he'd promised to review, finally said what she'd been swallowing for a month. "You do this," she said. "You disappear into deadlines the second something gets close to feeling real. I need you to tell me if that's what's happening right now, because I've already lived with a man who managed me instead of talking to me, and I won't do it twice." He didn't flinch, though it clearly cost him something not to. You're right. I reschedule things I'm not ready for and call it a scheduling conflict. I've done it my whole life. My father built this company being the loudest man in every room, and I spent years thinking I had to match him just to be taken seriously. Avoiding things quietly felt safer than admitting I didn't know how to be the version of myself he'd respect. He exhaled. I don't have a clean answer for you. I just have that. That's better than a clean answer, she said. Clean answers are usually rehearsed. So what happens now? He asked, and she heard faintly the echo of another man asking her the same question in a different kitchen, a lifetime ago, and felt nothing but the present moment answering back. Now you show up to Thursday's walkthrough, she said, and we keep having this conversation instead of avoiding it. That's the whole ask. He showed up Thursday. He showed up after that, more than he didn't. It became, slowly, the thing she trusted about him more than any single grand gesture could have. Not that he never disappeared into himself, but that he could be called back out of it, if she was honest enough to ask. Years later, when younger designers at the studio asked her how she'd survived those first uncertain months alone, Catherine never gave them the answer they expected. She didn't talk about resilience, or hustle, or proving anyone wrong. She told them, instead, about the night she sat on a concrete floor doing the same math 3 times and it still came out short, and how she'd learned, that night, that survival wasn't a single dramatic act of courage. It was choosing, over and over, in 100 small, unglamorous moments no one else would ever see, to keep building anyway. That's not very inspiring, one of them told her once, laughing. No, Catherine agreed, but it's true. The inspiring version makes it sound like courage arrives once and stays. It doesn't. You have to keep choosing it, especially on the days it would be easier not to. The tower opened 8 months after the pitch, its lobby exactly what Catherine had promised. True, instead of merely expensive. Her mother flew in 3 days early, so they could cook together, filling the apartment with jollof and gossip from relatives Catherine hadn't thought about in months. And for those 3 days she felt the simple, uncomplicated comfort of being someone's daughter again, with nothing to prove to anyone. At the opening, her mother wept at the mural, a woman standing between 2 skylines, Lagos and Seoul, neither erasing the other. Doyun didn't attend. She hadn't expected him to, and his absence didn't register as loss. What she didn't expect was the small, unmarked delivery that arrived at the studio 2 days later. A rare architectural print, no note attached, sent from an address she recognized as Mrs. Kang's private gallery. She never learned whether it was an apology or simply respect, finally admitting itself where words couldn't. She hung it in the studio's back office anyway, facing her desk, and left it at that. Some doors don't need to be reopened to be acknowledged as having existed. She thought of Mrs. Kang only once more after that, wondering briefly what it must cost a woman like that to send something instead of saying it, and then let the thought go, unresolved, the way she'd learned to let most things about that family go. Taemin found her near the mural, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. Your mother's charming, he said. She told the mayor's assistant, I have kind eyes. I believe that's a Nigerian seal of approval. It's the highest compliment she gives. Don't let it go to your head. Too late. He glanced at the mural. You never told me what it means. It means I stopped waiting for someone to build me a place to belong, she said. I built it myself. Everything after that was just deciding who got to stand in it with me. And who gets to stand in it now. She turned to him, something settled moving through her that she hadn't let herself trust in a long time. Ask me again in a year, she said, smiling. But I think you already know the answer. The rain fell over Seoul the same way it had the night Doyun, stood dripping in her doorway with 4 rehearsed words. Catherine stood at the window of a new apartment, smaller than the penthouse, but entirely her own name on the lease, watching the lights blur through the water on the glass. Taemin's voice carried from the kitchen, asking if she wanted her coffee black or with sugar tonight, the way he always asked, never assuming. Black, she called back. Always black now, she thought, sometimes, of the woman who'd folded a dish towel with trembling composure and refused to let her husband see her break. She was proud of that woman. She had survived on that woman's calm for a long time, but this, being fully seen, fully named, fully at home in a life built on her own terms, was something calm alone had never been able to give her. This was what came after surviving. This was what it felt like, finally, to simply live. If you've made it this far with Catherine, you already know why this one stayed with people. Subscribe for the next story, and tell me in the comments, was it the divorce scene, the Korean reveal, or the ending that hit you hardest?